So, about 3 weeks ago, Monsieur Z, also known as Dean, uploaded a video called Why Austria's Empire Collapsed and How America is Repeating Its Mistakes. Now, as the resident Austria-Hungary expert and autist, I wanted to genuinely see what Dean had to say. As you guys know, me and him are very good buddies. We hung out most of the time on the Zcast where we talked for hours, but we also hung out a bunch in private as well. And I do genuinely consider him a good friend. But unfortunately, his video is kinda mid. Now, to be fair to Dean, the purpose of this video is mainly to endorse his ideology of Utahism by drawing parallels between Austria and the United States. The things he says about the empire is mainly a jumping off point. However, I have still found quite a few inaccuracies or misrepresentations when he is talking about Austria. But compared to other people I responded to, his takes aren't really like malicious or so wrong to the point I have to pull my hair out. He is talking more in general terms from an overview perspective rather than getting into the details with a specific thesis in mind. The responses here are more of the yes but variety rather than the no you're a dumbass kind, although unfortunately the latter sometimes appears, but it's not as frequent like in my usual responses, so I actually have to commend Dean here. For that reason, I will be going a little easier on Dean here, and I will also be talking more in general terms as well, from the top of my head and what I remembered from previous readings, rather than pulling out paragraphs from my army of sources. So it's a little more casual, and since I have to get this video out before Halloween, I wouldn't have to spend as much time listing through my sources, and from the looks of it, I expect this video to be close to an hour long. With that out of the way, let's jump right in and see what Dean has to say.
Prior to the Austro-Prussian War, Austria had stood as one of Europe's greatest powers, and even up to and during the Great War, Austria, then the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was still a force to be reckoned with. But as the war came to an end, the empire fragmented and collapsed almost immediately. Austria's empire comprised about a dozen or more major populations, ethnic and religious groups who in many cases remained under Austria's supremacy for centuries. The Austrian Habsburgs devised a brilliant strategy early on which allowed them to grow their territorial holdings within and around the Holy Roman Empire, adding to their wealth, manpower, strategic reach, and prestige, all of which contributed to their preeminence in the HRE and the common election of a Habsburg to the role of Holy Roman Emperor. For Imperial Austria, diversity was in fact a strength, because it meant more raw resources, more manpower, but as the world progressed into an era of nation-states and tossed aside multi-ethnic empires, and as technology supplemented what previously would require more human capital, diversity became more of a liability and homogeneity a strength. People groups who previously perceived themselves as too vulnerable to stand alone, or merely saw their identity through the lens of an imperial identity, could suddenly afford to think of policy in terms of our culture, our history, our people, our future. Hitching all of that on an empire led by some foreign population whose interests might have already diverged from your own at multiple points, well, that just wasn't going to cut it anymore.
Okay. A few things here. First of all, Austria-Hungary was not a multi-ethnic state, it was a multinational state, the same way the European Union is a multinational organization. The difference is subtle, but it is very important. Dean says that these nations did not want to be ruled by some foreigners and wanted to pursue their own ethnic group's interests, right? That's the thing, there really was no such thing as a foreign people ruling the empire, like in the case of the British Empire, it was the British people who ruled over everything and the other peoples merely lived under their rule and laws. Austria-Hungary didn't really have that kind of system. The central focus was the Habsburg family, not Austria as a nation or people. Sure, the Habsburgs spoke German, but they were not necessarily seen as Austrian in the way where they exclusively pursued Austrian interests. They were seen as almost a-national, not belonging to any specific peoples or nation, if you get what I mean. This is something that kinda annoys me. Just because you are, even within a multi-ethnic empire, speaking in general terms here, it does not mean you do not have a culture or that it is automatically suppressed. If you look at Austria-Hungary, all the national awakenings like the Czech, Hungarian, Ukrainian, Polish, Slovak, Croatian, Bosniak, you know, all these musicians, philosophers, intellectuals, writers, all those people came from the dual monarchy. And that was not necessarily antagonistic, like for example in the 1848 Pan-Slavic Congress which took place in Prague, a lot of the delegates supported the rule of the Habsburgs. Well, it was mainly split between the pro-Russians and the pro-Habsburgists, and a very significant percentage of that Congress spoke in favor of the Habsburg monarchy. Josef Frisch, probably one of the most famous of the delegates, said something along the lines of that the goal was the preservation of Austria and that the only debate was on the means. Like, that's the thing. A multinational empire, by its own definition, includes different nations. Czechs, Poles, Hungarians, Ukrainians, so on and so forth. These nations are not necessarily incompatible or in conflict with the state. The dual monarchy wasn't a people imposing their will on the others like the British Empire. It's different peoples and nations under a common imperial structure. So that means these peoples can also have their own cultures flourish, and it's not against or in opposition to the general identity of the state. In the end, I am a Czech, but I'm also a subject of the Emperor, not a subject of Austria, but the Emperor, the Imperial Habsburg family. So, in a way, it is a very unique circumstance that is special to Austria-Hungary. The Russian Empire, for comparison, was a multi-ethnic empire. It wasn't a multinational one. It was a Russian empire pursuing exclusively Russian interests. It pursued the Russification of Poland, Ukraine, the Baltic states, Central Asia. And at the end of the day, I cannot be a Ukrainian because it's a Russian empire that is actively suppressing Ukrainians because, you know, they all have to be Russians. In Austria-Hungary, you could just be, you know? I feel like this is the biggest and most glaring problem in this video. You will definitely see this as it goes on. I feel like Dean, I wouldn't say he can't, but more like he overlooks that there are varying national structures, not just the nation system kind. He talks about Austria-Hungary here through the lens of a nation state, an Austrian imperial state imposing its will on others, when Austria-Hungary wasn't a nation state, you know? Like 90% of the problems I have with this video would be averted if he treated the dual monarchy as its own thing with its own unique national and imperial structure, rather than Yugoslavia 2.0.
The same was seen beyond Europe's immediate borders, with the Turks implementing a far less organized and far less sophisticated model which expected only loyalty to the empire from its scattered nations or millets, giving them every opportunity to fortify their identities while simultaneously offering little incentive to remain a part of the empire. Doubly so as the Ottomans, like the Austrians, struggled in the pursuit of an identity. In the case of Austria's empire, unable to decide whether it was a German, Catholic, or Balkan leader, yet refusing to concede any ground in any of those fields. Meanwhile, for the Ottomans, they could not decide whether they were a caliphate based upon pan-Islamic identity, a Turkish civilization that needed to Turkicize its clients and purge those who resisted, or perhaps it was a secular empire of peoples equal and united under the figurehead of the Sultan and the leadership of a parliament. In essence, both were divided on whether their identity should be defined by their faith, ethnicity, or political circumstances. As nation-states, they could have all three, but as empires, not so much.
The Ottoman Empire and the Habsburg monarchy are comparable in many ways. But there is a huge difference here actually. In the Habsburg monarchy, again, loyalty and the institutional framework was the royal family. In the Ottoman Empire, funnily enough, it was still the royal family similar to the Habsburgs, but there is an extra there. I would argue, more than the House of Osman, it was Constantinople. If you think about it, all the political life, all the administration of the empire was Constantinople. People on the right tend to have this idea that the Ottomans was this Turkish Muslim state that exploited their Christian and non-Turkish subjects and sent all the wealth to the Muslim regions to enrich them, but no. Muslim Anatolia was an absolute hole. I'd argue even more so than the Balkans. They were exploited the exact same way as all the other regions of the empire, and all the wealth, both from Muslim and Christian territories, would be directed towards Constantinople. In fact, Turks, like Turkish people, Turkish culture, was seen as backwards by Ottoman nobles and elites in Constantinople. It was literally seen as inferior and uncivilized. Ottoman sultans either preferred Western culture or they preferred Persian culture. They didn't practice any kind of Turkish culture as we may think of it today. So these are very similar yet very distinct entities, Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, and they evolved very differently. Regarding his point, all these ideas and identities, as Dean calls them, are conditioned by the circumstances of the time. You can apply this to both Austria and the Ottomans. Dualism in Austria was a thing that was very inconceivable for the neo-absolutism envisioned by figures like Bach and Schwarzenberg at the time, until you get the War of 1866, when Austria-Hungary was in a very difficult situation, but now it is forced to turn, by the present circumstances, to embrace the dualistic model with Hungary. It's not like the Habsburg monarchy was standing in front of a wardrobe, unable to decide whether it wanted to put on the German, Italian, or Balkan suits, as Dean makes it out to be. All these things depend on the position Austria-Hungary found itself in, and I will get a little more into that later. But in fact, this isn't a unique thing about these states. It's something they all went through in the 19th century, even the ones that could be called nation-states. Italy, for example, was very much an absolute monarchy until you had 1848, by which time the King of Sardinia was forced to turn his nation into a constitutional monarchy. The Russian Empire had the whole orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality movement, which clashed with the more liberal Decembrists, who also had their own vision of how the Russian identity should look like. In Germany, you had the Confederationists who also wanted a German empire, but one that was more a confederation with a stronger emphasis on local identities and culture, which clashed with the centralism espoused by the Prussians. So again, these are not unique things to these states, where they had conflicting movements which all had their own ideas on what kind of identity they should pursue. Even nation-states had them. It's not a multi-ethnic exclusive one. Dean says that Austria couldn't decide whether they wanted to be an Italian, Balkan, or German leader, but I would seriously wager, in Austria's case, that this was more of an external factor rather than an internal one. The reason Austria couldn't be a Balkan leader was because Russia also wanted to be a Balkan leader. There was competition there. And Austria couldn't be an Italian leader because of France, which also had interests in the region. And the same thing is going on in the German regions with Prussia. It was foreign circumstances rather than internal ones. Actually, the internal factors of both Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire were shaped by the external factors. If the Ottomans had never lost the Balkan Wars, Ottomanism would have survived. If Austria didn't lose the Austro-Prussian War, it would not have considered dualism as strongly, and this goes for the theaters as well. Austria only started getting involved in the Balkans when they had lost their hold on Italy, and then later Germany. Before that, Austria would have given less of a if the Balkans were ruled by either the Ottomans or the Russians. At no point did Austria seek to be an Italian, German, and Balkan leader all at the same time, so that's another thing. So I am not really a fan of the point Dean is making here. Again, he makes it seem like Austria was standing in front of a big wardrobe and could not decide which suit to wear. Because first of all, every 19th century European nation was going through these changes, even ones that could be seen as nation states. And secondly, external factors were much more influential in this change of identities rather than internal ones.
The fact that the Austrian and Ottoman empires followed such similar paths and met such similar fates is fitting given just how intertwined they had become. While the history of Austria began with the rise of the Habsburgs, the emergence of Austria as a multi-ethnic empire beyond just a mere duchy of the Holy Roman Empire wouldn't fully manifest until the 1500s, when the expansion of the Ottomans and the death of the Hungarian king in battle led Austria to acquire Hungarian, Croatian, and Bohemian lands, introducing into the Archduchy a large population of West Slavs, South Slavs, and Magyars.
No, that's actually quite wrong. Austria was always very multi-ethnic in a way, and I mean multi-ethnic, not multinational. The very idea of Austria was born from the Carolingian conquest of the East. Austria was the Eastern realm, bordering the Magyars and the Avars. Even when the Babenbergs ruled Austria between the 10th and 13th centuries, the region of Vienna was always a sort of battlefield between Czechs, Magyars, and Croats. And remember, the Habsburgs were not Austrian, they were Swiss, they were Alemannic. They came to Austria from southern Germany. For example, the way the Habsburgs spoke was very Alemannic, which would contrast with what you would call today Austro-Bavarian. Like, it's not a new thing, this thing of being multi-ethnic to the Austrians, because they were seated in a region where the demographics always shifted, since it was the eastern realm bordering the other countries and peoples, on which territory a lot of battles were fought. When the Habsburgs came, the demographics were still shifting around. For example, the Carinthian area was still very much Slavic. In fact, most Austrians in Carinthia today have some Slavic blood in them from the Slavs that lived there 1,000 years ago. That is why Slovenians and Austrians are ethnically speaking related, despite one being Germanic and the other Slavic, exactly due to the intermixing that took place all those years ago between the Germanic inhabitants of Austria and the Slavic Carinthians. Vienna, as another example, since its foundation had a very big Czech population. You would have a lot of Czechs, especially from the Moravian region, coming to Vienna and settling there. They were usually artisans and they would manage to trade very easily through the Danube River with the rest of the Holy Roman Empire. So the river was the main reason for them settling there. So again, regarding Dean's point, it wasn't a new thing in that region. The Austrians already had experience with the Slavs, mainly the Carinthians and the Czechs. And that is actually the origin of Austria's ability to manage multi-ethnic and multinational states in the future. The system and experience predates the Habsburgs, especially the expansion by quite a while. You could even call it a tradition.
Now, the Ottomans, following the war against the Holy League toward the end of the 1600s, ceased their expansionism and were finally put on the defensive by the Christian West. Gradually, across the late 1500s and 1600s, land was retaken and secured from the Ottomans, restoring Hungarian and Croatian lands while fortifying Habsburg authority within these realms. Austria became an effective protector of Croatian and Hungarian populations from the Ottoman scourge, and now began eyeing additional influence across the rest of the Balkans. Intermarriage was of course the historic Habsburg strategy to weave their way into the royal families of Europe's kingdoms and gradually pull new lands toward them in a personal union where a leading Habsburg simultaneously acts as a monarch for multiple states. This was effectively the model seen in the early Austrian Empire. Bohemia and Hungary were technically independent kingdoms, while Croatia was the territory of the Hungarian kingdom, but both were ruled and shaped by the same monarch reigning in Austria, Bohemia more so.
They weren't technically independent kingdoms, they literally were independent kingdoms. They had their own armies and they had their own nobility. Okay, an example. When Maria Theresia became Kaiserin of Austria, she had to go to Hungary and literally beg for support from the Hungarians. You wanna know why? The position of King of Hungary was electable. The Hungarians could have literally elected a non-Habsburg very easily. And eventually, she was elected as the King of Hungary, not the Queen or Kaiserin of Hungary, but the King of Hungary, due to Hungarian succession laws. She didn't have the authority to just place herself at the helm of Hungary. She had to literally beg for the position from the Hungarian nobles. And to just continue nitpicking here, Croatia was not a territory. It was also an independent kingdom, but okay, that's the thing. Croatia was independent, but the Croatian monarchy was related to the Hungarian monarchy. It's complicated, alright? I don't want to make this longer than it has to be. It's feudal relations and but to hammer the point home here, these were still independent kingdoms. They had their own armies, their own nobility, they had different privileges, their own laws, own succession laws. In essence, all independent states that shared a common monarch, but outside of that are still very much independent, particularly in terms of domestic affairs, who could and often have acted in their own ways. It's not technically, they are independent, Dean. And the reason I am going on this tangent is because this is a very important thing to keep in mind and know when talking about the Habsburg monarchy. This is the bare minimum to analyze and interpret anything happening at all times. If you cannot understand that fact, then you are unable to understand how the Habsburg monarchy worked.
Outside of a shared ruler and of course the common defense provided by Austria against the Ottomans and the French, who had become an ally of the Ottomans, common Catholic faith acted as a grand unifier for the empire, and the symbolic importance of the Habsburgs retaining the title of Holy Roman Emperor contributed to their legitimacy in the eyes of the Bohemian, Croatian, and Hungarian Catholics.
Not exactly a fan with the way he phrased that. Common defense provided by Austria against the Ottomans. The defense was not provided by Austria, the defense was a combined effort. Hungary, on its own, could not fight the Ottomans or France. Bohemia on its own could not fight the Ottomans or France. Austria on its own could not fight the Ottomans or France. But all these three countries together could. Are you starting to see what I am getting at here? This is the issue I brought up from the beginning. Dean keeps seeing this as Austria imposing on the others, with Austria being the dominant one. There's no real dominance going on here. There's an equality actually. And the reason there is an equality is because all these states separately are not able to exercise their will as effectively, but together they are able to exercise a lot of power in the region. And that's the important distinction. Again, that has to be understood above everything else, because if you don't understand this, you cannot understand anything else.
The Slavic Bohemians, prior to their introduction to the Habsburg Empire, but during their time as part of the Holy Roman Empire, would see the supplanting of Catholicism by the Hussites, who would become a majority, and this schism would be further inflamed by the Reformation. It is in this form that Bohemia became a part of the Habsburg realm, and for a time it was tolerated, but as the Reformation intensified and gave way to the 30 Years' War, Bohemian Hussite, Calvinist, and Lutheran nobles rebelled against the Habsburgs, who proceeded to crush the rebellion, ban the practice of Protestantism within Bohemian lands, and force the conversion or expulsion of the kingdom's nobility, who would also have their power dramatically diminished, and see Bohemia become an effective extension of the Austrian realm, something akin to England and Wales when compared to the rest of the United Kingdom.
Misleading. First of all, the primary reason why the Habsburgs were deposed in Bohemia is a bit debated and there is no clear-cut answer. There were some participants in the plot that did it for religious reasons, yes, but not everyone was part of that reasoning. Part of it was because some Bohemian nobles wanted to push for greater ties with the other states within the HRE, because the guy that was selected to be King of Bohemia, Frederick V, also known as the Winter King, was a Calvinist, and when he came to Bohemia, he started smashing a bunch of religious icons very important to the Bohemians, which, kinda ticked them off. It wasn't like in EU4 where you press the Declare Independence button and immediately the entire country joins you. Rather, you could see it as a civil war. Many Bohemian nobles were opposed to the actions of the Winter King, and that basically split the country into the Protestant and Catholic side. A good example is Albrecht von Wallenstein. He was a Bohemian, and he fought on the Catholic side during the 30 Years' War, so on the side of Austria. The entirety of Bohemia didn't just flip to the Protestant side. No, there was a civil war in Bohemia over that question. Now, the revolt by the Protestants most definitely did curb Bohemia's special status to an extent, but it was nowhere near to being reduced to a province or extension of Austria. Not only was Bohemia still the richest part of the empire at the time, but was still a very important part of the empire because they were an elector within the HRE. Austria was not an elector. The reason the Habsburgs got a vote and participated in the elections of the HRE was not because they were the Archdukes of Austria, but because they were the kings of Bohemia. If the Habsburgs reduced Bohemia to merely another province of Austria, they would lose their vote and influence within the HRE. So even if the Austrians didn't want it to, Bohemia had to still be kept around in one way, shape, or form. Yes, it wasn't as autonomous as before, but nowhere near to the point of being reduced to just another province of Austria.
A process of Germanization would go hand in hand with this, as Austrian nobles would take seat in Bohemia, replacing old nobles and begin proliferating the German language among the elite and educated circles. A similar suppression was carried out very early on in the lands that would later become the country of Slovenia among both the German and Slavic Protestants, bringing that region back under Catholic rule.
So, the Germanization of Bohemia. Future Lavader here. So when I was done recording this whole thing, and then when I moved on to the editing part, I realized that I accidentally strawmanned Dean here in my response. I was going off of the assumption that he meant that Austria wanted to intentionally Germanize the areas of Bohemia, through an actual Germanization policy. But then I realized that this wasn't the case, that he basically just said that a Germanization process went hand in hand with this. So I was planning on, cutting this part off entirely, but I thought that it would still have some bit of educational value, since, I actually go a little more in depth in regards to how Bohemia became Germanized in the first place. So for that reason, I'm still keeping this in, but again, keep in mind that I'm actually, strawmanning him here, so try to take this as additional context. Just to point out, this was before the invention of nationalism and national projects. Bohemia's Germanization and the way it got such a large German-speaking population wasn't really because there was some kind of mass settlement of Germans to the region and because the German language was preferred. It didn't come about top-down as it usually goes today. Rather, the Germanization of Bohemia came about through a more organic way, specifically due to its economic ties to the HRE. Bohemia was one of the richest territories of the Holy Roman Empire, so rich that everyone from other regions wanted to have a client there, and it was the first territory everyone turned to. So imagine it like this: if you are a merchant or artisan from Bohemia, your main trade partner is within the German territories, either Frankfurt, Nuremberg, or some other big city. So in order to capitalize as effectively and efficiently on this opportunity as possible, you learn to speak German because all your business and trade partners/clients are German speakers. So then, over time, since you want your children to inherit your business, you want them to also learn and speak German because that's where all the big money is made. Then, if you, for example, want to get a job at the Imperial Library, you have to learn German, which is why in the Middle Ages and the late Middle Ages, German is spoken in the big cities of Bohemia like Prague, but the countryside still overwhelmingly spoke Czech. Why would a dirt poor peasant need to learn the language in the first place? And so, part of the reason why Bohemia slowly started losing power was because slowly over time, that interconnectivity got much stronger, if you get what I mean. The Czech nobility starts to become more connected to Austria proper. They start going to spend more of their time in Vienna. Like again, this was a whole process that took over 300 years gradually. So, a good portion of German Bohemians were just Germanized Czechs who came to speak German and use it more to do business, yada yada. But there was also some settlements by Germans from Germania, but the top-down, hey, go over there and make that land German kind of settlement never really existed. Germania within the HRE always had a surplus of population, especially artisans, craftsmakers and swordsmiths and so on. The first wave of German settlers came under the rule of the Przemysli dynasty, who were Czechs, not Germans, and they invited them over in order to make up for labor shortages. They would settle around Prague and the other big cities, and of course the Sudetenland, and then after that intermixing started happening because they married Czech families. Then the second wave came after the Black Death in order to, again, make up for labor shortages and people. It's a very complicated topic because those two factors influenced the Germanization of Bohemia, the labor shortage which caused German settlers to come, and the gradual Germanization of Czechs due to economic integration. Again, complicated topic. I just repeated what I knew from the top of my head. But in any case, there was no Germanization in the proper sense where Austria would send all these people in with the aim of making Bohemia more German. No, that never really happened because the concept of national projects as we know them didn't exist back then. And what Dean mentioned about German nobles coming into Bohemia, that had more to do with stabilization and loyalty than Germanization. They just wanted to restore control and order to Bohemia, and the safest thing to do in that case was to bring in Catholic nobles, which were most of the time German. Another interesting case was down south in Slovenia. When the Protestant suppression happened, the German Styrian nobles were Protestant, while the Slavic Slovenian nobles were Catholic. So guess what happened at the end? hand, Slovenians got more shit at the expense of the Germans because they were seen as more reliable and loyal compared to the Protestants. The same thing happened in Bohemia. It had nothing to do with Germanization, rather it was mainly a side effect.
This ignoring of problems would ultimately come to a head in 1848 when mass uprisings and nationalist movements erupted across Austria and Europe, most notably within Hungary. The new emperor Franz Joseph seized upon the chaos as an opportunity to crush what had become the most rebellious and resistant region of the empire. The Hungarians in 1848 had launched a massive revolution, sometimes referred to as the Hungarian War of Independence. The revolution was opposed by just about every minority population, as they feared the extremism of Hungarian rule, desiring to continue within the Austrian Empire, albeit with greater autonomy, creating a messy situation for the Hungarians. However, Austria would shoot itself in the foot by promising great autonomy to each of these populations, and later failing to deliver, only bolstering pre-existing national sentiments in the decades that would follow. Austria would ultimately intervene, allowing Franz Joseph to place Hungary under Hungary would become subject to a major campaign of Germanization. The Hungarian language was suppressed in favor of German. Hungarian officials were effectively purged and replaced with Austrians. Education was fully under Austrian control. Austrian settlement in Hungary would increase. Protestant institutions were closely surveilled, and Catholicism was reinforced.
Where do I begin here? Okay, first of all, the Hungarian Revolution. Again, just like in the case with Bohemia during the 30 Years' War, it wasn't the entirety of Hungary and the aristocracy rising up against the Habsburgs. There were many, and I do mean many, pro-Habsburg Hungarians fighting on the Austrian side against the revolution. Second of all, the period of martial law in Hungary took place during the whole period of neo-absolutism within Austria as a whole, so it was around the time figures like Schwarzenberg and Bach tried to centralize the empire. But again, just like in the Bohemian thing, it wasn't about Germanization, it was about uniformity. Hungarian wasn't banned as a language. I don't know where Dean got that information from, but the German was exclusively used. I think that's what he means. So what happened was that you now had, in the form of the German language, a kind of standardized language the bureaucracy was managed with, and this was a process that was underway even before the revolution. For the sake of uniformity and easier coordination, the bureaucracy had to be done in the German language on the imperial level. Local stuff could still be done in the native tongue, but on the empire-wide basis, German was standardized. The problem was, during the period of martial law, the Hungarians did their own thing called the passive resistance movement, where instead of openly revolting, they basically refused to participate in all political institutions, like they just wouldn't engage with Vienna in any way at all. So now Hungary, due to that, had a massive shortage of bureaucrats, state officials, and bureaucrats are kinda important to get things done. And the Austrians couldn't just put a gun to the heads of the Hungarians and force them to draft the Microsoft Excel spreadsheets. So what they did was, you guessed it, they sent over bureaucrats from the other parts of the empire to take over and manage those institutions, since the Hungarians were just giving the middle finger. And also, funnily enough, most of those bureaucrats weren't German. They were Czechs, because Czechs were mostly the bureaucrats and lower officials within the empire and had the most experience in these fields. Remember what I said, German on the imperial level but native tongue on the local level. Yeah, as another consequence of the Hungarian passive resistance movement, the entire Hungarian bureaucracy had to be standardized in German, because most of those bureaucrats and state officials couldn't speak Hungarian, and the Hungarians were too busy throwing their temper tantrums, so there really was no other choice, you get what I mean? Again, this is the thing I am talking about. People misunderstand Germanization as a concrete policy and Germanization as a kind of side effect or natural consequence. Of course, when you have one unified or common language on the upper bureaucratic level, when you have a centralized state, of course it's gonna cause a degree of Germanization. That's an effect of it. But it doesn't mean that the Germanization was caused by a policy of deliberately trying to Germanize the area. You're confusing consequence with intent, if that makes sense.
Despite some modern accounts, many of which are written by Hungarians, the Germanization and suppression process had actually been on a path toward success. In effect, it was following in Hungary the model which had been followed in Bohemia centuries earlier, even more so as modern infrastructure like rail lines accelerated the pace at which people and information could move, contributing both to the spread of the Austrian language and population within Hungary.
The funniest part here is that Dean is right. Yes, the process was similar, but unfortunately, he doesn't understand the process in question. What happened in Bohemia was also happening in Hungary. Rebels were defeated, land and power were stripped from disloyal people and then given to loyal people. And again, that's the thing that is causing the Germanization, not a specific policy. And the reason why this Germanization was successful in the first place was because it wasn't a deliberate attempt to Germanize the regions. Oh, I love when things are ironic like that.
Of course, something went wrong. That something was France and Prussia. France under Napoleon III had styled himself as a patron of nationalism and specifically of the Latin peoples, and he threw his support behind Sardinia in their campaign to unify Italy through the conquest of land held by Austria. Thanks to French support, the Italians utterly defeated Austria, reducing it of land and humiliating it. Moreover, the Habsburgs' historic, albeit loose grasp over the Italian peninsula was now thoroughly eroded. This sphere of influence was now effectively closed to them forever.
Okay, no. It wasn't the Italians that defeated the Austrians, it was the French. In fact, after the war, the territories of Lombardy and Venetia weren't handed to the Italians, they were handed to the French. Because every battle the Austrians fought against the Italians, they won. But when they fought the French, they lost. So the logic was, the Italians did not deserve that land since we kicked their asses. But the French did because we lost against them. So they were handed to France, and then it was France that handed those territories to the Italians. Like, this is just genuinely hilarious to me. Like a last middle finger to the Italians. I just wanted to tell this funny story.
The Austrians were forced to contend with a difficult reality. They had two neighbors who they could not beat on their own. They had a whole rebellious section of their empire under martial law. Moreover, the country was deeply in debt with no viable way to pay it off, and their one ally of Russia they had abandoned during the Crimean War, leaving the Austrians broke, alone, and vulnerable.
The reason why Austria abandoned Russia during the Crimean War was because the Austrians found themselves in a very difficult diplomatic position, where no matter which side they picked, it would have gone badly for them. If Austria had joined the Russians in the Crimean War, it meant that it would have to open up a front and fight the Ottomans in the south, while also being at war with the French and the British, while at the same time having half of the country under martial law and still trying to stabilize yourself internally while having mountains of debts. Do you really think the Austrians, in that state, could have afforded a war with Britain, France, and the Ottomans? Like, come on, any EU4 and HOI4 player would know how to answer that. And yes, standing by and doing nothing would have lost Austria the only real ally they had left, Russia. So again, this is the definition of an impossible diplomatic position. Whichever side Austria took, it would have bit them in the ass with no real positives. And with hindsight, I'd say they definitely took the least bad option since Russia lost the Crimean War. And who knows how badly it would have gotten for the Habsburgs then. So there is definitely a lot of nuance here, but I wouldn't just say that they abandoned Russia without even mentioning the position Austria was in, because you make it seem like they deliberately chose to not side with Russia when they easily could have, you know?
Hungarian society at this point must be understood. It was predominantly agrarian, still dominated by a rural landowning elite who saw themselves as defenders of Hungary's historic constitutional sovereignty. The suppression of the Hungarian Revolution crippled the Hungarians initially, but in subsequent years following the end of martial law, they only grew more emboldened and steadfast in their identity, even beginning a Magyarization process of their minority populations to reassert dominance, as the Hungarians only constituted about 50% of the population within their own lands. The greater influence of the Hungarians led them to veto and restrict Austrian efforts to strengthen the empire and commit to geopolitical plays, whether supporting France against Prussia in the Franco-Prussian War, acquiring colonies during the Berlin Conference, formalizing and reforming the military, projecting influence into the Balkans, and of course, establishing additional crowns by fully reforming the empire's structure. Every single opportunity thrown in the gutter by the Hungarians because they didn't want to raise taxes, they didn't want the Austrians getting stronger, they didn't want their own power being watered down. It's all so tiresome.
This is the part of the video that I would say ticked me off the most. I am no stranger to thinking that Hungary, in a way, was a bit of a hindrance at times, especially when it comes to the military and them refusing to contribute more to military spending, which was one of the factors behind why Austria underperformed a bit in the first year of World War I. But they were not a complete roadblock as Dean makes it out here. First of all, he mentioned that Hungary prevented Austria from joining France in the Franco-Prussian War and that this was a bad thing. Tell me, why in the ever-loving would Austria try to go for a round 2 with Prussia, again considering the domestic situation in the empire at the time, dualism still being experimented with and implemented, being broke with a whole heap of debts, and them being utterly defeated by the same army in a war only 5 years ago? Do you really think it was smart for Austria to attempt to join that war, particularly now with hindsight considering how that war went in the first place? The Prussian army would have steamrolled through Austria. The Imperial army was absolutely in no way, shape or form prepared to fight the Prussians. In what world would it have been a good idea to go to war with the Prussians in the state Austria was in? Like, the majority of Austrians did not even want to fight the Prussians in the first place. They knew that would be a terrible mistake. But if they did, and the Hungarians vetoed it, I would argue that they would be absolutely in the right here. If anything, Hungary would have been acting as a voice of reason. They would be saving the empire from an even worse state than it already was in. Second of all, regarding the colonies part, one little question. Why did Austria-Hungary need colonies in the first place? Like, tell me, why was that a necessity? Now, try to look at the map for a moment. Let's say the Austrians genuinely wanted to pursue colonies somewhere in Africa. I am gonna give you 10 seconds to look at the geographical position here and then try to figure out why there would be a cartload of risk involved. You would have to go from the Croatian coast through the Strait of Oranto, which could be easily blockaded by another naval power in the Mediterranean, and even if you managed to get through that Strait of Oranto, you would have to go through either the Suez Canal or the Strait of Gibraltar, both of which, again, could be easily blocked off by another naval power, and only then do you reach Africa. And for what? Looking back at the map Dean showed, what in the could Austria do there in that Somalian territory? There was nothing there. It was a desert where camels outnumbered the people living there. You literally couldn't even farm there since the ecoregion has very sandy soils, dunes, and is sparsely vegetated. The only real potential for resource extraction there was salt. Salt. So keeping all of this in mind, I think any person with an IQ of over 90 would recognize that this was absolutely not worth it at all. And what the Hungarians actually vetoed was not this Somalian proposal, but the Western Saharan one, since the idea had been floating around to buy the Western Sahara from the Spanish. But it's literally the exact same situation. The Western Sahara was also desert with no real natural resources that could be extracted. Literally all the colonies Austria was proposed with were utterly useless, and even if there was one that wasn't completely useless, like, okay, India, sure, you still had to factor in the big risk of passing through 2 easily blockadable straits to get to the colony in the first place. It wasn't worth the trouble at all. We are talking about the most dog colonial ambitions possible. The Hungarians were completely right to oppose this bullshit. Like, how is this a bad thing? Okay, the Hungarians used to veto a lot of good, This was not one of them. And third of all, in regards to projecting power and influence in the Balkans, do you know who it was that convinced the Austrians to take over Bosnia? It was the Hungarians. If it wasn't for them, Austria would have never considered taking Bosnia in the first place. Do you want to know the country that was the most pro-expansion in the Balkans? You guessed it, it was Hungary, completely contrary to what Dean is saying here. The question here is, what type of expansion we are talking about, because the Hungarians were opposed to the annexation of new territories outright. What Hungary wanted was to have informal influence, puppet states essentially, satellite states or whatever else you want to call them. The Hungarians were in favor of this kind of expansion, they were just opposed to annexing them. That is why Bosnia had its own unique status within the empire, a condominium, and why the annexation only came like 30 years later after enough preparations were done to formally integrate the territory within the empire. The Hungarians were even pushing for Romania to become part of Austria-Hungary's economic sphere. They wanted Montenegro to join the sphere as well. Again, this is what I'm talking about. The Hungarians were very happy to pursue expansion in the Balkans, but not one that would outright annex those territories, since they believed that would cause more problems. So not only is Dean's point here wrong, but compared to the Austrians, it was the Hungarians actively pushing for expansion. All I am saying is, let's not pretend like the Hungarians were nothing else but a hindrance to the empire. That is just false. Many times, they were also the voice of reason in debates and issues.
Other minority groups within the empire grew envious of Hungary and sought their own crowns within the empire. This would have effectively balanced imperial powers and prevented the disproportionate sway Hungary had with blanket vetoes. This was unacceptable to the Hungarians because of the simple fact that, say, a Slavic crown, or even two Slavic crowns represented by Croatia and Bohemia, would have represented some 50% of the total population, more than double Hungary's own, and the Hungarians were absolutely unwilling to see themselves sidelined. It's for this same reason Hungary resisted potential land expansions into the Balkans, refusing to add more Slavs to the empire and water down their own share of the population.
We are talking about Hungary having disproportionate vetoes, but here's the thing. Austria also had veto rights as well. What I don't like here is this characterization of Hungary as this guy who keeps getting in Austria's way and not budging on anything. But this is an equal relationship we are talking about here. Hungary can veto Austria, but Austria can also veto Hungary when the Hungarians do something they didn't like. It's an equal relationship. There is no power imbalance here. Dean is talking as if, again, through this nation-state analysis and worldview, that Austria was on top and Hungary was below, and the guy below kept causing problems for the big guy. No, it's equal, on the same level, both sides, you know what I mean? And regarding his point that Hungary opposed the establishment of more crowns because they would be sidelined due to population differences, like, Dean, this is not how things would have worked. We are not talking about the American Electoral College where, like, California gets 54 electoral votes compared to Wyoming's 3 due to population differences. Like, no, that's not how it would have worked. If a Croatian and Bohemian crown was established, they would have been completely equal to Hungary in every way, no matter how many people they had. The constitutional agreement was not based on population size. Bohemia could have had 10 million inhabitants and Hungary like 5 inhabitants, literally like 5 guys. The Duke of Puppenfarten, the local cleaner, and like 3 servants, and Hungary would still be equal to Bohemia politically in every way possible. Oh sure, Bohemia and Croatia would have gotten veto rights, but guess what? Hungary would still have theirs, whether it was to do a monarchy with just 2 states, a trial monarchy with 3 states, or an empire made up of 10,000 states. Nothing would have changed for Hungary. They would still have the same veto rights as before, only now they would be able to veto other people's and not just Austria's. And another major point, Hungary wasn't entirely opposed to the idea of reforming and federalizing the empire. Funnily enough, Hungary itself was a dual state, within a dual state, due to the Kingdom of Croatia and Slavonia. So, in the dual monarchy, you had Cisleithania, which was the Austrian half, and Transleithania, which was the Hungarian half. And within Transleithania, you had Hungary and Croatia, which were both equal to each other. Whenever there was a session of parliament addressing all of Transleithania, you would have seen two flags, the Hungarian and the Croatian one, not just Hungary. So, this concept of playing equal with somebody else wasn't alien to the Hungarians. Hungary was never really outright objecting to reforms. What they were most worried about was the institutional arrangements. Hungary was very afraid, with some reason actually. Even though I disagree, I have to give them credit for their reason. Like, if the empire tried to copy-paste Hungary's status to Croatia, Bohemia, or any other state, it would have naturally caused some issues. So in order to add more crown lands, you had to also change the institutional framework. You had to negotiate. There would be a negotiation over it, an Ausgleich. And Hungary was right about being concerned. And you know what? Ultimately, Hungary accepted the proposal of the trial monarchy. I mean, yeah, it came just before the collapse of the empire, but they still accepted it after lots of negotiations. In fact, during those negotiations, Hungary accepted to revoke their absolute veto rights, in return for everyone else revoking their absolute veto rights as well. Like, you get what I mean? They weren't completely opposed to the idea of federalization. They were just very careful at it. And even though the empire would collapse sometime later, the fact that Hungary accepted after many negotiations shows that the Hungarians weren't this giant roadblock that Dean makes them out to be. There is a difference between being very careful and just being a stubborn piece of
You also had external agents, which, when you're a powerful country with something others want, is just an inevitability. However, Austria is attempting to hold influence in Latin Europe, Germanic Europe, and Balkan Europe earned it more enemies than it needed. France, Prussia, Serbia, and Russia, and also left it overextended to a point that its position became weak in all three realms. This overextension is yet another factor which is very much Austria's fault. It wanted to have it all and refused to accept the reality that it had to choose a future for itself.
Like, as I said at some point in the beginning, at no point in time did Austria seek to dominate the Balkans, Germany, and Italy all at the same time. The Austrian fixation on the Balkans came only after they had lost their footing in Germany and Italy, which of course caused some conflicts of interest with Russia, a nation with which Austria never really had that many problems historically. And also, the goal of Austria and Italy and Germany was never to annex and conquer them. It was to bring them under their imperial dominion, under their sphere of influence, and for a pretty long time, they were successful at that. The 1848 revolution failed in Italy. Austria managed to prevent Italian unification then. Same thing in Germany. They managed to prevent German unification. One needs to understand the fact that Austria's strength never really came from its military, unlike other countries. It was diplomacy. Diplomacy was the primary and most powerful weapon the Habsburgs had. The turning point only came after the Crimean War, because after that Austria had become diplomatically isolated, because Austria's diplomatic power hinged on the concert of Europe. It was to a degree overextended. Yes, but that overextension worked when the concert of Europe worked. When it was destroyed initially with the unification of Germany and Italy, Austria automatically lost its greatest weapon and influence. Because this entire project depended on the balance of power, and Austria generally benefited from it. When the balance of power was destroyed, there really was nothing the Austrians could have done to maintain their thing. Even if they wanted to. It's not that they didn't want to or were aloof to the fact. They simply couldn't because the balance of power, the thing Austria always relied on to do its thing, was broken. You could not maintain Italy if you could not maintain Germany and vice versa. They were connected.
The Latin path was effectively closed by the time of the Napoleonic Wars, so Austria shouldn't have even bothered trying to have claims in Italy. If anything, it should have propped up its own proxy to compete with France and Sardinia, and thus exert indirect control over the peninsula, rather than attempting to govern it directly. The Austrians had influence in Lombardy, Venetia, the Papal States, and the two Sicilies. Not taking advantage of that is just pitiful.
What? Austria shouldn't have bothered to have claims in Italy? Okay, do you want to know what the richest province in the Austrian Empire was? Actually, provinces. It was Lombardy and Venetia. People often say that it was Bohemia, but no, before Bohemia it was these two provinces that were of utmost critical economic importance to the Habsburgs. Literally the only reason Austria got a navy in the first place, for example, was because they had the Venetian Republic in their hands. Again, Italy was the richest area, and you need to understand, Germany, the German Confederation, was a political tool for Austria. It was only useful for political stuff. Italy, on the other hand, was the economic tool due to its economic importance. Austria fundamentally approached these two theaters differently. In fact, I will go as far as to argue that the Italian theater was more important overall compared to the German one, because Austria got very little out of it. They actually didn't even want to participate in German economic affairs. This is why Austria rejected the plans of the Zollverein, the German customs union, because economically they would have gotten little out of it. But Italy was a completely different story, because Italy actually benefited Austria immensely. It's here that Austria got its first middle class, and it was here that they actually got influence. In Germany, Austria couldn't just barge into, for example, Saxony and restore order. In Italy, they could. During the 1848 revolution, Austria sent troops to almost every Italian state, to Tuscany, to Modena, Lucca, everywhere. They even sent troops to the Pope. Because here, Austria could have had as much control as they wanted. The only area of Italy Austria didn't have control over was the island of Sardinia, and yet they still had plenty of influence there. Like, this idea is very stupid. Why would Austria give all of this up? Hell, they would rather ditch Germany than Italy. Why would they just hand over the richest provinces and the area they had the most control over? And yes, in the end, the French beat them and they lost their hold over Italy. But to say that they didn't take advantage of that influence is just wrong. They very much tried to milk every drop they had out of it.
We can say the exact same for the Germanic lands of the Holy Roman Empire and later the German Confederation. The Habsburgs were the leaders here. They had every opportunity to assert themselves as sole masters of the German world, but wanted to both dominate Germany and have a distinct empire of their own. Prussia exploited this to frame Austria as unpure, not a true German state, but a mishmash of peoples that were more Slavic than German. But still, Austria had a shot even up to the Austro-Prussian War, when the majority of the German Confederation rallied behind them. Austria was essentially handed a free pass to unify Germany with all of its imperial lands in 1850 with the Four Kings Alliance and proposal of Greater Germany. However, Austria was too skeptical of the proposal because they saw it as creating a more powerful German confederation, even if they were still recognized as its leader. And part of the reason why is Austria still saw itself as an empire separate from Germany. They wanted it both ways, and even when they got the best possible offer, they weren't satisfied. So Prussia took their spot.
Dean assumes here that unifying Germany under Vienna was an actual goal by the Austrian Empire. Here's the thing you need to understand about Austrian foreign policy at the time. It worked on the idea and basis that a unified Germany or Italy would have been a threat. A threat. So Austria's goal in both cases was to prevent any kind of German or Italian unification. Why would they want to unify Germany if that literally goes against their entire foreign policy idea? Like, just because they had a free pass to do the thing doesn't mean it was in their interest to do it. I mean, France under Napoleon also had a free pass to unify Germany. You wanna know why Napoleon didn't do it? Because the idea of a unified German state in Central Europe was seen as a geopolitical threat to the empire, so it was in France's interest to make sure Germany was as fragmented and divided as possible. Austria's attitude to Germany worked the exact same way. And again, Austria saw Germany as little more than a political tool. It was just a bunch of pawns for them, something to be used. The same way Napoleonic France saw the German states as pawns. But let's think for a moment that this wasn't the case. Okay, let's say Austria genuinely wanted to unify Germany. Even if Austria wanted to, and if they had the power to do it, they would have not been able to do it. You wanna know why? In 1871, when Germany was unified under Prussia, it sent powerful shockwaves throughout the concert of Europe. It effectively broke the balance of power that was in place before. Everyone had to reconsider their allies and allegiances. Now, try to imagine what would have happened if a united Germany formed with the addition of the Austro-German states and then maybe Hungary and the other territories under like a personal union but still part of the same imperial structure. That would have been an empire of 70 million people. 70 million. When Prussia unified Germany in 1871, the total population was around 40 million. If an empire of 40 million forming managed to break the balance of power, what the do you think how the European great powers would have reacted to one with 70 million? Infamy 100 Victoria II style and a coalition never before seen since the time of Napoleon forming. China would have joined the coalition. Point is, even if Austria wanted to unify Germany, the diplomatic repercussions would be so severe that it would be a horrible idea to even think about it in the first place. Like an EU4 player would be able to figure out that this is a bad idea. And that's really it right now. Dean spends the rest of the video talking about the United States and how the Austrian and American situations are comparable, and okay, I have gripes with that as well, like how he overlooks the fact that the political and racial environment and climate between these two nations is completely different, but I don't exactly want to try getting too far into it because I know how Americans absolutely love it when a European voices any kind of opinion on the good old US of A. And admittedly, I am a lot more knowledgeable on Europe than the United States, so I don't want to accidentally say something wrong. Addressing the Austrian part of this video was really, like, the most important part here. But yeah, I would say that about covers it for this video. My name is Lavader, and I hope you enjoyed today's content. Thanks to all the glorious people on Patreon who are supporting me in these endeavors. Special thanks to Mudkips Our Life and SOAV for their extremely generous and high pledges. That really helps me out a lot. Anyway, bye bye!